Talking specifically about other kinds of visuals, though, they serve a similar function to document design in that they make the documents more aesthetically appealing and make a document more understandable and usable. So the things that document design does, the kinds of user questions that it helps answer, visuals do the same thing. They just are doing it with different kinds of tools, I guess you could say. So when we talk about visuals, one of the things that's important to bear in mind, though, is that even though visuals do add aesthetic appeal, they are not principally just to make things look snazzy. I mean, it's good when they do, but you don't want to use visuals gratuitously. I think we've all seen a document at one time or another that uses crappy, cheap clip art just sort of randomly, and it doesn't make anything better because it's not actually contributing to the information that the document is trying to convey in any way, shape, or form. So as a rule, when you're presenting, say, an image, as I am on this slide, choosing an image that has information that reinforces what you're trying to convey with the words of the document is going to be optimal because it means that you're conveying the information in effectively two different ways, right? And that increases the opportunity for your audience to understand that information and be able to act upon it. So in the textbook, there are sort of four broad categories of visual methods of conveying information, and we're going to look at them each one by one because they have different sort of goals and purposes. So the first type of visual that you might see in a lot of technical communication is a table. So what's the situation where you think you might want to use a table, where that would be appropriate for your document? Maybe you might think about a situation where you've had to make a table in a document in the past. Okay. So Caleb suggests if you're trying to convey salt concentration and light transmittance, well, that's certainly the information that is conveyed in this table. So you are right about that. I've never personally had to convey information on that topic before, but if I did, I would choose a table. Okay, so comparison of data, that can be a good choice. And we saw that a few weeks ago when we talked about organization and we saw something that was using a table to compare. Yeah. So we do often see tables used in particular when we're trying to convey numerical data, right? Because if we were to throw this into a paragraph, it would be a not very readable paragraph, I think we could imagine. So as a rule, if you want to organize or compare data, this is a good choice, but you don't just use tables for numbers. You definitely can use tables to present qualitative information as well. The thing to remember about tables is when you're designing them, you want to have your audience and purpose in mind because the goal of a table is to make things quicker and easier to understand, not to drown your audience in data. So think about tables as a way to sort of lighten that load on your audience and make that information a little bit more accessible. All right. So a graph is another kind of visual. So when might it be useful to use a graph? And would that be different from a table in some way? Yeah, I think Kevin, you're absolutely right. Is the graph really shows the changes over time. So while this graph actually is also comparing data, right? Because this particular graph is comparing social media use for 4 different social media entities from a long time ago. That's more than 10 years ago. It'd be very interesting to get an update on this. It's more than just a comparison. It's showing that trend over time. So we are able to see how Facebook increased, in that time period, and I suspect it's changed quite a bit since then. But we're also able to see comparatively how Facebook uh, had a lot more volume compared to, say, Pinterest and Twitter. And I don't think we would necessarily see that at this point in time. So the thing to think about graphs is they are usually not so much conveying the numerical information that we would see in a table, but they're conveying information as shapes, right? So that means we're seeing lines, we're seeing bars, we're seeing sort of different um, geometric elements, I guess we could say, that allow us to interpret the information quickly. It's really vital, though, with graphs to remember to label all the elements, because without a title or labels or scales of reference, a graph is meaningless, right? So if we look on the previous page at the graph here, if we had no numbers, for example, on the y-axis, uh, we might think that there's a huge difference, for example, between Pinterest and Twitter. And while there is a difference, we're talking about the difference between 1% and 3%, which not ginormous, right? But having that scale is vital to helping us interpret these relationships accurately. All right, so a cousin to graphs are charts. And sometimes we see those words used a bit interchangeably, but when would we want to potentially use a chart? And maybe how would that be different from when we would decide to use a graph? So definitely this one shows us percentages of a whole as a pie chart, which is one kind of chart, right? So one thing you will notice, of course, is this kind of chart won't show us changes over time, right? And there are other kinds of charts, obviously, than just pie charts. But usually it's showing us some sort of relationship. And that relationship could be a different kind of relationship. For example, if we are looking at, for example, a flow chart, it isn't showing us percentages of a whole, for instance. It is showing us, though, the relationship between certain decisions we might make, right? So on this particular slide, there's a flow chart on the side of the slide, and has that typical decision tree kind of thing. You ask this question, is the answer yes or no? If it's yes, you do one thing. If it's no, you do another. So again, the focus is the relationship, even though in this case, with a flow chart, it's not really, it's not percentages or anything like that. Uh, so as a general rule, when you're thinking about what is the difference between a chart and a graph is going to have that XY axis or maybe even an XYZ axis, but a chart is going to be constructed differently. And it includes a lot of different kinds of visual illustrations, but the focus is always on usually the relationship of information. So then that brings us to the last type of visual, which is an illustration. So when would you choose to use an illustration? For example, when would you choose to use a photograph in a document that you're creating? I mean, yeah, I think exactly, Caleb. And I think that's, I mean, I chose this particular photo on this slide uh, to illustrate sort of that appeal to emotions. There's no sort of quantitative data expressed in this photo, although conceivably you could have a photo that did that. This particular photo, which was taken from early in the pandemic of a hospital unit full of very sick COVID patients, has a big emotional impact, right? I mean, it really gives you a sense of some of the danger and the fear, and it's a kind of a scary picture. So it can have that effect. But Edward's also right too. A lot of times a photo can help to add context to the data that we're providing, right? Um, Sometimes we see that in news reporting, for instance, a lot of use of photography to add sort of human interest or to add sort of a wider context to the situation. The thing about illustrations is they really definitely tend, as a rule, to be more qualitative than quantitative. Um, and so they can convey different kinds of things. Now, a lot of things fall into the category of illustration, so it's not just photos, um, but basically almost anything that relies primarily on pictures and not words. So this infographic has words on it and also numbers on it, but we would count it in the category of an illustration because it relies very much on the images of, you know, the social media icons, um, the thumbs up and thumbs down. I guess they're all thumbs downs on there because I guess social media is only thumbs down here, evidently. Um, so there are some graphs on this diagram as well. There's a pie chart on there, for instance, and there's certainly textual information, but it's conveying a lot through the visual information. And things like videos also count as illustrations too. One nice advantage of illustrations is that they can work cross-culturally. So in many cases, even if you can't read the words because you don't know the language, an effective illustration can help you understand what is being indicated, which is why we see a lot of icons. You know, if you go into a restaurant and you need to use the restroom, uh, even if you can't read, you can usually figure out from looking at the doors which is the women's restroom and which is the men's restroom, right? Because there are iconography on the doors that is meant to be somewhat universal to help you understand that. Uh, it is important when you choose illustrations, as with all of the graphical components, to make sure you're choosing illustrations with a purpose, not just the whole cheesy clip art approach. But sometimes it's definitely true that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So in addition to illustrations, one thing to think about too is the use of color. So how or why might we apply color in technical communication? I mean, maybe if you've ever used color in a document, you might think about what you used it for, or if you've seen it used effectively somewhere. So what does color help to do for us? They they definitely can have an emotional impact. Now, some of that can be tricky because um, different colors can have a different sort of emotional sense in different cultures of the world. So it is important if you're working internationally to be aware of those associations. But yeah, red in our culture in the US is usually indicating that something is important, like pay attention, or something is dangerous, right? In other cultures, it might be different. Caleb says, because black and white's boring, use color to indicate a change or important information. And that is one reason headings, for example, often use color, because that indicates a change topic. It helps that heading to stand out a little bit more from a background that's monochromatic, right? Any other reasons we might use color in our technical communication? catch the reader's eye. Yeah, I think it does. It adds, especially in an otherwise monochromatic situation, it definitely makes things more noticeable, and it can certainly add appeal. Well, I think that another reason we would see it in a lot of settings has to do with some sort of institutional branding, which is why, as I said before, everything at University of Houston has red in it somewhere, or um, a lot of times, different government documents, everything is red, white, and blue, right? Because it's supposed to show that this is, USA, or I'm supposing in other countries that have different national colors associated with their flags, they probably use those colors. Um, so it becomes sort of part of adding legitimacy potentially to a document, or showing that this is associated with the company. And if I asked you right now to picture in your mind eye the logo of a particular company or business, like say Facebook or Google or McDonald's, uh, I'm sure you can picture the colors in your mind that are associated with those companies, right? And so it becomes an important part of that. So there's a lot of reasons we do want to use color, but it's definitely something we want to be careful about. You don't want to do what I call the crazy clown vomit school of document design, where you look at a document and it's just got random color everywhere. You definitely want to maybe choose one or two colors that are part of a color scheme overall, and stick with that. Again, that might be associated with your business or organization's colors, so for branding purposes. But even if it's not for branding purposes, even if it's, you're just creating a slideshow or whatever, having a color scheme is usually going to be something that's going to make your document look a little bit more aesthetically pleasing, a little bit less kind of all over the place. So we looked a little bit ago at this revision of that COPD document that adds document design. But this particular document doesn't do too much with graphical elements, right? It doesn't add, for example, a table to convey some of this statistical information. The only real graphical element it has, aside from the use of color, is it does have the CDC logo at the top, which is a graphical element, and that does convey information, right? It conveys to us that this is official CDC information. But here's a different example of a document that is actually using some of these features we talked about. So this is not conveying the exact same information. It's on the same topic, COPD, but it is using graphical elements. It is mixing text and illustrations. It doesn't have any charts explicitly on here, but it's using a mixed grid, so it's kind of complicating things. So when you glance at this version of the COPD information, what stands out to you, or what impressions do you get from it? Is there anything that it makes you think or feel or understand about this topic that maybe the other version wouldn't have done? Induces sympathy. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Um, and I think one way that it does that is it actually shows human beings on this document, right? We see someone who appears to be a healthcare worker and someone who appears to be a patient, right? And so, and the healthcare workers looking at the patient with sort of a sympathetic look, and I think that conveys to us as the user. Jason says, I like the easy to read data ribbon. Yeah, to me, that really stands out. Both the sort of the ribbon on the side with the information about it, and also the data on the bottom about the different ethnic groups and the rates of COPD in those ethnic groups. It stands out so much more than the numbers over here, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of numbers on this page. And this is like reduce the amount of numbers, but the numbers it has presented, it's sort of made pop quite a bit more. Gives a little information of what the content is about. Yeah. So it's sort of tried to, I think, not info dump quite as much as the other document as well. And it's trying to, maybe convey a different stress about the issue, the idea that it's a national health issue, I think, here. I thought it's also interesting they have a different kind of title at the top. So the version over here of this information just says facts about chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is fine. I mean, that's what this is. It is facts about it. So that is clear. But this one has a different kind of title up at the top. Learn more, breathe better, which is kind of an interesting choice, right? I don't necessarily know from that title what this is going to be about if I just see that title. But on the other hand, it kind of draws me into the idea about, breathing better. Don't we all want to breathe better, right? So it's definitely trying to, I think, reach out to the audience in a way that this one, not so much, even though this is informative. So I think this is a good example of how a document that is still mostly a document focused on words can use design and graphics to convey more information to an audience, partly by generating more interest in a topic or more sympathy for the issue, or just making the information that you really, really want the user to have stand out, right? All right, so we are running short on time. So let's quickly just point out that when you are adding visual elements, it's very important to make wise choices, give your visual labels, use alt tags for accessibility for anything that's going to be presented electronically or digitally. You want to be responsible with your use of visuals and not overdo it. You also want to be ethical with your choices. So when you choose visual elements, don't choose things that might in some way mislead your user, such as a graph that is distorted. You also don't want to steal visuals from other people. So if you have not created the visual yourself, you want to give credit to the creator, maybe use Creative Commons options. You can limit your search sometimes to those kinds of openly available sort of visual elements.